Hello all and welcome to week 2 of remote learning amid this COVID-19 crisis. I hope you're doing well. I'm having a really good day today because I was able to buy toilet paper at Walmart. I had to push like 3 old ladies out of the way, but I got some, so that's a good day for me. We are starting in a new section. This one is about environmental policy, law, and regulation, and this is March 30, 2020. So just a quick overview of the course so you remember where we are again. This is good for all of us to check in. You remember our first section was on varieties of environmentalism and environmental philosophy. And then we took a little trip through major environmental problems that we face. And we just finished that last week with environmental justice and political ecology. Now in this final section of the course, we're going to be looking at some approaches to solving environmental problems, hopefully ending on a little bit of an optimistic note. And the first one we're going to look at is governance approaches, so policy, law, and regulation. And we'll spend the next few weeks going through the rest of these. And here I've listed at the bottom some of the sources that I've taken some of the materials for this lecture from. First of all, before we get into this, don't forget this is an important week. Every week is important, but this one is particularly important. You have your third quiz this week. It's on Wednesday, April 1st. And I've changed the time. I sent out an email to you, so hopefully everybody understands. Beginning at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That's the time of our normal class period if we were all meeting together. I changed it from 1:30 because I realized we have at least one student in China, and this might be less in the middle of the night for him than if I did it at 1:30. So we're going to start this at 11:30 a.m. I put a review sheet on Notebowl Bulletin. Mostly it covers biodiversity and ecosystem services stuff, and then environmental justice and political ecology, which we talked about last week. So you should take a look at all that stuff and have done those readings and watch the videos and all that stuff, and have your notes all ready for that. The quiz will be 3 essay questions, open notes, open book. Each of those will be worth 20 points, so it's a 60-point quiz. And you'll have a 2-hour time limit, although I don't think it will take you 2 hours to do. It is open note, open book, but you're not allowed to communicate with anyone before, after, during that exam, that quiz, just to be fair to others. So please do it yourself. I'm planning to hold open office hours, virtual office hours on Tuesday, the 31st. That would be tomorrow, from 3 to 4 Eastern Daylight Time. So I will send you a Google Meet link and you can join me if you want to, if you have questions about the quiz material, or if you just want to check in and say hi, that's fine too. If you don't, that's totally fine. If this time does not work for you because you have a conflict or because where you are in the world it just doesn't work, you can also send me email questions and I will try to respond. So we're going to try this quiz virtually. We'll see how this works. If there are kinks, we'll try to work through them, and we'll see how it goes. Best way for you to prepare is to have done all the readings and all the video watching and have your notes in order so that you don't have to waste too much time sorting through all that stuff and you can get right to your answers, crafting your answers for the questions that I pose. Don't forget you also have an environmental justice lab that's due this Wednesday, April 1st by midnight on Notebowl, and I previously gave you the instructions for that. Okay, so back to where we are. So let's talk a little bit about governance approaches as a solution to some of our environmental problems. So let's go back to the tragedy of the commons. Our good buddy Garrett Hardin. We talked about Garrett Hardin and the tragedy of the commons way back before we knew about this virus. We were so young and innocent. And you'll remember that the tragedy of the commons is that individuals will take more of the resource or create more of the pollutant, thereby ruining the commons for all. And Garrett Hardin did not say that this problem did not have a solution. In fact, one of the solutions he recommended was, he said, mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. Here's the quote that you can see. And what that means is that people need to come together to make rules that they all agree upon, and then they need to hold each other to those rules. And that's really what environmental policy and law and regulation is all about. Of course, this has helped a lot of our environmental problems, but it also creates other problems. It creates tensions between individual rights and the common good, because sometimes the common good means that each individual can't acquire or do what they want to do with their resources or with common resources, and they are restricted in some way. So let's take a look in the United States anyway, how we attempt to do this mutual coercion. So generally what works, sometimes this doesn't work, but generally we have some sort of discussion and debate. This might be at the representative or senator level, or in political debates and things like that, or it could be at a very local level. Sometimes that leads to political action, and a lot of times we think of this as a policy. So that word policy we'll look at really is sort of the big picture framework. So for example, a locality like, let's say, Granville might say, we're concerned about our water source and we don't want it to be contaminated. So we're going to come up with a policy that is about protecting our water source. That could be a local environmental policy. Or we could have a national environmental policy to increase our use of renewable energy. We really don't, but we could have such a thing, right? So policies like that are big framework ideas, and usually they lead to legislative proposals. So proposals for laws or rules, right? And if those get approved, then we have laws, and the laws come with regulations. In other words, a law might say something like, okay, farmers can only spread these kind of pesticides and fertilizers on their field because we are worried about water contamination, and they can only spread this much. A regulation then comes out of that, and that is actually, how is this going to be checked? How are these farmers going to be monitored for what sort of pesticides they're using, what sort of fertilizers they're using, how much are they using, during what time of the year are they using, who's going to check this, what are the penalties if there are violations, and so on. So you can see maybe how something like an idea, a political idea or a policy, can basically trickle down to becoming a law and a regulation. And then, of course, checking compliance to make sure individual people are, or organizations or companies are complying with that regulation. So this is how it's intended to work. So just quickly to look at some definitions here. Your first reading this week was about some of these ideas, but an environmental policy essentially is a state or a nation state, you could say. It's a deliberate action taken by a nation state to manage the activities of the population in order to prevent, reduce, or alleviate any harmful effects on nature and its natural resources. And they could have added, in this definition I took from a source, they could have added to protect human rights as well, because a lot of times environmental rights and human rights are closely interconnected. So a policy is a big overarching idea. A law is a little different than a policy. Laws involve set standards, where a policy is sort of a decision-making framework. The law might set particular standards that are going to be measured. A law is much more formal. It's a system of rules and guidelines that are made for implementing justice. Laws can be modified, of course, and reviewed and amended, and they usually are over time. They can evolve. And laws are made for the people, because this is part of our mutual coercion idea. We're going to coerce each other into agreeing with this and complying with it. And laws can be judged by the courts too. So sometimes laws are found to be unconstitutional, for example, or the overreach of certain laws is found to be too much, and they have to be revised. So laws and policies can change over time. Regulations and rules, of course, are different than policies as well. Rules are very specific. They come out of laws, and they are the specific thing that needs to be measured or to be regulated to decide if someone is in compliance. Policy is much broader than rules, and it's usually a general statement, whereas rules and regulations are very, very specific. How much of a certain fertilizer can you use during which time of year, and so on. Okay, so let's take a quick look at environmental regulations, at least in the United States, how these fall out, and a lot of other countries are similar, but this looks at the US EPA as an example. So the way it works in our country, at least at the federal level, is a policy is set by, let's say, a political party, or maybe a president or an administration, and then the legislative branch makes a law, passes a law signed by the president, and then this becomes the law of the land. And then it's up to the agencies that they are the ones that interpret that law and enforce it. So, for example, the EPA might be charged with enforcing a law that is about pesticide use. And maybe that law didn't spell out exactly what the interpretation should be. And so the agency has to figure out, okay, how much of what pesticide during what time of year, how are we going to monitor that, and how are we going to enforce it? So in these little boxes down below here, they kind of show 4 components to regulations. So usually policy, the society has sensed some sort of problem, a risk to health or a damage to the environment, and needs to be regulated. That's what comes out of the policy and the law. It identifies a regulatory target. So this could be a product like food, or a particular pollutant like a pesticide, or an industrial facility like a coal burning power plant, or a particular agency that's going to do this work, or a land use, or an individual or an organization. All of those are targets, regulatory targets. It also establishes a basis for establishing the controls. So is it a technology-based control? Is it a risk-benefit balancing? Is it a health-based regulation? In other words, what are you trying to establish here? Is it a use of a technology, or is it you're trying to minimize risk, or you're trying to minimize the effects on human health or environmental health? And then finally, an agency has to figure out the type of regulation. So design standards, in other words, design of a factory or of an air conditioning system or of a food processing system. Performance standards, how well does it make the product that it's attempting to make? Information standards, how much is reported, like in food, for example. Do we have to report the iron content of food? How well is that measured? How is that information to be conveyed? Ambient standards would be things like air quality or water quality. So if you work in a factory, there might be regulations saying, how many pollutants are allowed to be in the air that you're breathing and at what concentration. Liability rules, who is liable for any problems that occur, and then taxes. So who might be having to pay taxes to support some of these regulations. So regulations are complicated. The agencies have a big job of trying to translate a law into a regulation and to try to figure out who it's targeting, what's the basis for establishing this, and how it's going to be regulated, how it's going to be measured. So these are very complicated, and often they get challenged in court. So that makes it even messier. So again, sticking with the United States EPA, just to show what they try to do, they have 4 basic pillars. First of all, if they can, when they get an environmental law that they are supposed to enforce, they're going to try to avoid, not avoid the work, but avoid that problem altogether. So if they can outright ban a substance, let's say, they might choose to do that. A lot of times it's not so much an outright ban as it's trying to minimize the risk. So sometimes we can't fully eliminate the risk altogether, but we can minimize it. So control and manage are referring to mitigating or minimizing the risk that people face or that environments face because of some activity. So these sort of pillars are sort of what an agency like the EPA uses as they try to form a regulation. Okay, so how well does this system work for governing the commons? It works okay, and next time we'll take a look at some history of the United States environmental laws and regulations, and we'll look at in some ways how those have really improved our situation in this country, although they're not perfect. One thing that you should understand is that in basically every country, I can't name a country in the world where environmental policy and law and regulation were systematically planned out beforehand, that there was a grand scheme that they said, okay, over the next 100 years, let's do this. That's usually not how it works. Unfortunately, they sort of evolve as a patchwork. And here's what I mean by that. Different political parties and leaders, as they come into power, have different policies. So policies change over time. Right now, our government has certain policies that are not the same as they were 10 years ago, right? And maybe in 10 years, they will be different still. So policies come and go and change over time. Laws get changed and amended over time too. Most of our large federal environmental laws get reviewed every 5 years and they get amended. So Congress can change those laws over time. Regulations get challenged in court and sometimes they get overturned. So fairly frequently, if you're paying attention to this sort of thing, you read in the news that EPA enforced some law with a regulation and that got challenged in court, and the court determined that EPA overreached its bounds and did not really have the authority to do that. And so they had to change their regulation. So regulations can change over time too, and people can challenge these. And then finally, a lot of our government in general, but as a lot of our environmental policy and law and regulation is more reactive than proactive. So what that means is that often we make these rules, these laws, these regulations in reaction to some sort of problem that we have. Like, oh, we found lead in drinking water. Ooh, we have to figure out how to regulate that. We have to figure out how to test and who to find liable and who to find responsible for that. It would be nice if prior to the problem, we had a process of checking drinking water for things like lead. But oftentimes we don't, because there's almost an infinite number of potential hazards and risks out there, some of which we don't even fully understand yet. And to try to create a law or a regulation for all those things when they're not yet a problem, that would be difficult to pass because most people don't want more regulation. So we tend to be reactive more than proactive. So what this means is that our environmental law in this country is a big old patchwork of judicial decisions and changes in policy and amended laws and change regulations, and it's kind of a big old plate of spaghetti. It gets pretty confusing pretty fast. Okay, so there's this concept of environmental democracy, to take a step back a little bit and to think of how nations work in general. And as I mentioned, environmental laws are closely intertwined with human rights laws. So we can think of those two kind of working, and we just talked about environmental justice, so you should understand that pretty well. So in the best scenario, individual citizens should be involved with environmental rulemaking and should have the ability to protest and to change laws if they want to. So the World Resources Institute, WRI, in 2015 put together kind of a report on environmental democracy, and they looked at most of the nations in the world to determine how well they do environmental democracy. And here were some of the criteria that they used to evaluate this. First of all, do citizens have the right to freely access information on environmental quality and problems? That should be a right? We should have the ability as citizens in a democracy to access information. The second one, citizens should have the right to participate meaningfully in decision making. So do you as a citizen have the right to weigh in if you want to on a particular environmental law or regulation as it's being formed? 3, citizens should have the right to seek enforcement of environmental laws or compensation for harm. So in other words, if a law is saying that your drinking water should be protected from lead, and then you have it tested and you find out that your drinking water in fact has lots of lead in it, way over the upper limit, you should have recourse, right? You should have compensation. You should have the ability to enforce or have those regulations enforced for the people that are responsible for providing your drinking water. Okay, so in this country, we have most of these, more or less, although sometimes the way we can weigh in or participate meaningfully in decision making is a little bit obscure and not that obvious, but we at least have representatives, right, that we could contact to weigh in with our opinion. Not every country in the world has this. Some countries have it better than we do. So what I'd like you to do is take a look at this. I'll post this on Notebowl Bulletin. And this is a short article put together by the World Resources Institute called Best and Worst Countries for Environmental Democracy. It's kind of interesting, and it's a short read, but it gives you kind of the top 10 or so, and then the bottom 10 countries for what they call an environmental democracy index. And take a look at that, and you can see kind of what makes some countries better than others in terms of environmental democracy, how their governance system works for helping solve environmental problems. So next time we'll take a look, I'll just show you this quickly, at kind of the evolution of environmental law in the United States. So we'll start with pre-1945, so pre-World War II, the end of World War II anyway, how things tended to work. We really didn't have a lot of environmental laws at that time. And then 1945 to 1962, and then really 1962 to 1970, rise of the modern environmental movement right here. We'll spend some time looking at that because, of course, that was when a lot of, that's when Garrett Hardin wrote his article, and that's when a lot of the environmental laws that kind of govern our country today came into being, or at least the idea came into being. And then we'll talk about post-1970 and some things that have happened since then. So until then, study for your quiz, and if you want to, connect with me to review for the quiz, and I'll be in touch on Wednesday. Have a good day.